I was polishing the silver tray my mother left me, the one with tiny scratches only I could recognize, when I heard them in the next room. My children weren't whispering, not even lowering their voices. They were dividing my possessions as if I were already gone. The brooch for one daughter, the china for another, my husband's watch for my son. I stood there, cloth in hand, feeling the room tilt. Alive, yet treated like a ghost. This is just the beginning of my story about family, betrayal, and quiet defiance. Tell me, where are you watching from? I had believed that my home was still mine, that my belongings were safe, anchored by memory. But in that moment, I realized I was nothing more than a placeholder for them, a caretaker of things they felt entitled to. My heart sank, yet something sharper flickered too. The betrayal was cruel, but it was also the spark. So let's get into what happened after that moment when I stood frozen, cloth in my hand, listening to my children divide my life like it was already theirs. At first, I didn't even move. I felt like if I stayed still enough, maybe the words floating through the walls would dissolve and I could pretend I hadn't heard them. But of course I had. Every word, every claim, every casual assumption that I was already out of the way. I walked back into the room, not saying a thing. They didn't even look guilty when they saw me, which made it sting worse. They smiled politely, the way people do when they're caught gossiping, but don't think it's really a big deal. My son stretched out on the sofa like he was already the master of the house. One of my daughters pointed at the china cabinet and said, "It'll look great in my dining room. I'll finally have space for it." I could feel my breath catch in my throat, but I pressed my lips together. What was I supposed to say? That every plate in that cabinet held a memory of Sunday dinners when their father was still alive? That I remembered who chipped which cup and why? That those pieces weren't just furniture or tableware, but pieces of me? If I said any of that, they would have rolled their eyes. They would have called me sentimental or dramatic. That word, dramatic, has followed me my whole life. So I stayed quiet. Inside, though, I was screaming. It felt like being erased while still standing in the room. Imagine your family writing your obituary while you're stirring soup on the stove. That's what it felt like. They were already drawing up my estate, not caring that I could still hear, still see, still breathe. After they left, the silence of the house was heavy, almost mocking. I moved from room to room, running my hands across the surfaces of the things they had already laid claim to. The chair by the window where I used to sit with their father after long days. The lamp they joked about being ugly. The one that once kept light on while I stayed up waiting for them to come home as teenagers. My mother's brooch, tucked away in a box lined with velvet. I stopped in front of the cabinet again. I opened the glass door and touched one of the teacups. The sound of it clinking gently against the shelf was enough to bring tears to my eyes. Not because it was valuable in money, but because it carried years of family stories that only I remembered. That was the cruel part. That these objects were alive with memory for me, but dead weight to them. I sat in the armchair with the cloth still in my hand and thought, what am I supposed to do? Just wait until they take everything, piece by piece, as if I was never here. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening to the creaks of the house, feeling its presence like a living thing around me. This home wasn't just walls. It had held laughter, anger, secrets, and countless meals. And, yet in their eyes, it was already stripped bare, ready for the next stage of their lives. I thought about confronting them, about shouting, about demanding respect. But then I imagined their faces, the way they would dismiss me again, maybe even laugh at me. That was the part I couldn't bear. The laughter, the disbelief in their eyes that my voice still mattered. Instead, I let the anger simmer quietly. The next morning, I made myself coffee and sat at the table, staring at the sunlight spilling across the floor. Something shifted in me then. If they could so easily decide my fate, then I could too. If they saw me as powerless, maybe it was time to remind myself that I wasn't. I didn't know what that meant yet. Not exactly, but I knew this. I wouldn't let them strip me down like I was nothing but a collection of things. Later that week, one of my daughters stopped by again. She walked through the rooms with a smile that looked more like satisfaction than love. "You should really think about downsizing, Mom," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "This house is too much for you. Too much." I nodded, biting back the words boiling in my chest. I let her leave, believing I agreed. But the moment she shut the door behind her, I felt something else spark inside me. A quiet rebellion, small at first, like a candle being lit in a dark room. I started by opening boxes I hadn't touched in years. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my bedroom, pulling out jewelry I hadn't worn since my 20s. Scarves that still smelled faintly of perfume. Books with folded corners from late nights. One by one, I touched each thing, asking myself what it meant to me. Not to them. To me. For the first time, I wasn't just a keeper of these objects. I was weighing them, measuring their worth in my own story. And as I sat there, surrounded by what they called clutter, but I knew was a diary of my life, the idea began to form. Faint, unsteady, but unmistakable. Just maybe, these things could serve a purpose my children never imagined. The idea lingered in my mind like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. Maybe these things, the ones my children dismissed so easily, still had a purpose I hadn't considered. But before I could imagine what that purpose was, I found myself circling the house, room by room, drawn to the weight of the memories hidden in every corner. I began in the living room, where the air still carried faint traces of furniture polish and old wood. My husband's chair sat in its usual place by the window, fabric worn down at the arms where his hands used to rest. My son had called it too big and said it should go. Too big for what? For memory? For love? I lowered myself into it, the cushions sighing beneath my weight, and I closed my eyes. Suddenly, I could hear his laugh, low and easy, as if he had only stepped out for a moment. That chair wasn't just furniture. It was the closest thing I had to sitting with him again. I stayed there longer than I meant to, clutching the fabric as if holding on to him. When I finally stood up, I wiped my eyes and told myself that maybe I was foolish, maybe I was clinging too tightly. But then again, wasn't love always about clinging, even when time demanded you let go? I moved next to the hallway shelf where we kept souvenirs from our few family trips. A seashell from the shore, a snow globe from a winter market, a tiny carved elephant from a roadside stall. My daughter had laughed at them once, saying they looked cheap. Maybe they were. But when I held that seashell to my ear and heard the faint roar of the sea, I remembered the way the kids used to run barefoot across the sand, screaming with joy, while my husband and I watched from under a faded umbrella. How could anyone look at that shell and not see a whole summer glowing inside it? As I picked it up, I realized something that startled me. The weight of memory was heavier than the object itself. To me, each thing was alive, pulsing with moments no one else could see. To my children, they were just things to be divided, claimed, sold, forgotten. The gap between those two visions felt like a canyon, wide and unbridgeable. That night, I found myself digging through a box at the back of my closet. Inside lay my mother's brooch, a delicate piece shaped like a flower, stones missing from its petals. I hadn't worn it in decades, yet when I held it up to the lamp it shimmered faintly, as if refusing to surrender its beauty. My daughter had already called it for herself, saying she'd take it after I was gone. The thought filled me with a bitter kind of amusement. She wanted it not because it mattered, but because it was shiny, old, and might fetch something if appraised. I pinned it to my blouse that night, just to see how it felt. Standing in front of the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. It was like seeing my mother's face hovering faintly behind my own. The memory pressed against me so strongly I almost lost my breath. The more I touched these objects, the more I realized they were not clutter. They were a diary written in things instead of words. Every scratch, every stain, every crack carried its own story. And yet, if I tried to explain that to my children, I knew they would laugh, the way they laughed at so much of what mattered to me. In the kitchen, I lingered over the china set. White plates with tiny blue flowers around the edge. Ordinary, maybe even outdated. But they had been at the center of so many meals, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays where laughter spilled louder than the clatter of cutlery. I ran my fingers over the rim of one plate and remembered the Christmas when my youngest had broken one, crying so hard I had to assure her it didn't matter. I kept the broken piece tucked away in a drawer, proof that imperfection still had value. As I held the plate, a sharp thought cut through me. If my children couldn't see the worth of these things now, they never would. To them, I was just the gatekeeper standing between them and the spoils. The realization settled heavy in my chest, heavier than any object I touched that night. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, staring into the steam. Part of me wanted to box everything up, to protect it from their greedy eyes. Another part whispered that maybe I was the one who had to change. Not to give in to them, but to reshape what these objects meant, and to whom they would matter. I didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time, I felt a thread of defiance winding through the sorrow. They thought my life could be measured in objects, in who got what. But I was beginning to wonder if there was another way to measure it. Another way to decide what these things were worth. When I finally went to bed, I left the brooch on the nightstand beside me. The last thing I saw before closing my eyes was its faint glimmer in the dark, a reminder that I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was silent, heavy with that particular stillness that follows sleepless nights. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the brooch on the nightstand. Its faint shimmer caught the light creeping through the curtains, and I thought, if they want it so badly, maybe they'll never touch it at all. That thought startled me. It was sharp, almost mischievous, and unlike the resigned silence I had grown used to. For years, I had let my children decide for me where I should live, how I should spend my money, what I should hold on to. It had always seemed easier to nod than to argue. But now, with their voices still echoey, nung in my head, dividing my life like spoils, something inside me hardened. I walked slowly through the house again, but this time I wasn't just remembering. I was weighing, deciding. My hand trailed across the china cabinet, the photo frames, the worn edges of the sofa cushions. I whispered to myself, they don't get to write the ending of my story. I do. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat down at the table with a notebook I hadn't opened in months. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowing at the edges. I usually used it for grocery lists or reminders, but that morning, I wrote down the first sentence that came to me. This is mine to decide. The words looked shaky on the page, but once they were there, I couldn't stop. I started listing the items in the house, not for division, not for inheritance, but for meaning. Next to each one, I wrote down the memory attached to it. The seashell from the beach trip, the broken plate from Christmas, the chair where my husband sat. The list grew quickly, filling the page. What I was creating wasn't an inventory. It was a map of my life, told through the things they thought were meaningless. By the third page, my hand ached, but I felt a new energy coursing through me. The objects weren't just reminders. They were fuel. And in writing their stories, I realized something. I didn't have to wait for my children to claim them. I could decide their fate now. The thought was terrifying and liberating all at once. My children would be furious, of course. They expected compliance. They expected me to fade into the role of caretaker, quietly handing things over when the time came. But why should the person who had lived every second of these stories be silenced at the very end? I set the pen down and stared out the window. The morning sun was brighter now, touching the edges of the garden where the flowers I planted last spring had started to open. For years, I had told myself I was too old to change, too tired to resist. But maybe resistance wasn't about strength. Maybe it was about choice. Small choices, steady ones, that built into something larger. Later that afternoon, my daughter called. Her voice was brisk, as always. Mom, did you think about what we discussed? About sorting things now while it's easier? I almost laughed. Easier for whom? Instead, I said, I've been thinking, yes. Well, good. Because the sooner we know who gets what, the smoother it will be. I can come by this weekend. A pause stretched between us. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe. Then I said calmly, I'll let you know when I'm ready. Not before. The silence on her end was thick, almost offended. She muttered something about being practical, then ended the call. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, heart racing. but I smiled for the first time in days. That single sentence, "not before," was the beginning of my rebellion. That night, I pulled out an old box from under my bed. Inside were letters, photos, little scraps of life I had tucked away. I read a few of the letters, hearing the voices of people long gone, and I felt them reminding me, your story is yours, not theirs. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine something bold. Maybe I could decide where these objects went. Maybe I could gift them while I was alive, to people who would cherish them for their meaning, not their price. Or maybe I could let them go entirely, freeing myself from the weight of being their caretaker. The brooch glimmered faintly on the nightstand again when I climbed into bed. Only now, it didn't feel like a relic waiting to be claimed. It felt like a symbol of something I hadn't dared believe in for years. The right to choose my own ending. And as I drifted into sleep, I whispered to myself, they don't get to decide. I do. The next weekend arrived quickly, though I hadn't invited anyone. By late morning, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find my daughter standing there, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of determined expression that used to silence me when she was a teenager. Behind her, my son leaned against his car, scrolling through his phone. They had come together. "Mom, we just thought we'd get a head start," she said briskly, stepping inside without waiting. "It'll be easier if we do this together." I felt the old reflex tug at me, the urge to nod, to let them lead. But then I remembered the notebook tucked in the drawer, the pages filled with memories only I could name. My voice was steady when I said, "I didn't ask you to come." My daughter froze mid-step. "We're just trying to help." "Help with what?" I asked, following her into the living room. "Taking what isn't yours yet?" The words hung in the air, sharper than I intended. My son finally looked up from his phone. "Mom, don't start. We're being practical for who?" I countered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. My daughter shuffled her papers, clearly irritated. "This doesn't have to be difficult. If we organize things now, there won't be arguments later. It's for your own peace of mind." I looked at her. At the woman I had raised, who once clung to my hand at school drop-offs, who used to cry when she couldn't find her stuffed bear. Now she stood before me, voice clipped, eyes impatient, as though my wishes were inconveniences to be managed. "My peace of mind," I said quietly, "comes from knowing I still have a say in my own life." Her lips pressed together, a habit she had whenever she thought someone was being unreasonable. My son sighed loudly, as if the conversation itself was a burden. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. That word rang in my ears. For decades, I had avoided being hard. I had tried to be agreeable, to smooth over every bump to keep the peace. And yet here I was, cornered in my own home, treated like a problem to solve. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out a photo album, laying it flat on the table. "Do you see this?" I said, flipping through the pages. "These are the years I raised you, the holidays I cooked for, the nights I stayed awake when you were sick. Every picture, every page, that's my life. And if I want to decide what happens to these memories, I will. Not you." My daughter's eyes softened for a fraction of a second before the stiffness returned. "No one is taking your memories, Mom. We're talking about things. Objects. They're not just objects," I said firmly. "They're mine. And they stay mine until I say otherwise." The silence stretched again. My children exchanged glances, the kind that carried whole conversations without words. I recognized it instantly. It was the same look they gave each other when they thought I was being difficult. The same look teenagers share when their parent embarrasses them in public. My son finally muttered, "Fine. If you want to drag this out, that's on you." He walked back outside, slamming the door harder than necessary. My daughter hesitated, her face softening for a moment. "Mom, you're making this bigger than it has to be. We just want to be prepared." "I've spent my whole life preparing," I said. "Now I want to live." Her mouth opened slightly, as though she wanted to argue, but instead she closed her clipboard with a snap. "We'll talk later," she said, and left. When the door closed, the house was quiet again. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from adrenaline. I had never spoken to them like that before. Every part of me was buzzing, part triumph, part grief. Because even as I stood my ground, I knew I was also losing something. The closeness we once shared felt further away than ever. I sank into a chair, breathing deeply. The weight of their disappointment pressed on me, but so did the faint thrill of having chosen myself. It was messy, painful, but real. That night, I sat with my notebook again. On the next page, I wrote, "I am not a burden. I am not a placeholder. I am still here." It didn't erase the sting of their words or the way my son had slammed the door, but it anchored me, reminding me that I wasn't wrong to want control over my life. Conflict was inevitable now. I could feel it coming, like thunder building on the horizon. But for the first time, I wasn't shrinking from it. The phone rang early one morning, its shrill tone slicing through the quiet of my kitchen. I glanced at the clock. 7:15. Calls that came at odd hours always carried weight. I hesitated before answering. "Mom, we need to talk," my son said without preamble. His voice was clipped, impatient. "It's about the house." My chest tightened. "What about it?" "We've been talking," he continued, "and it doesn't make sense for you to keep living there alone. It's too big, too much to maintain. You should think about moving in with one of us." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. Moving in with one of us, stripped of choice, reduced to a problem they could shuffle between homes. "I'm not leaving my house," I said firmly. "Mom, you can't keep being stubborn about this. What happens if you fall or get sick? Do you want us to just watch something bad happen?" The sharpness in his voice wasn't concern. It was strategy. He was painting me as fragile, incapable, a problem in need of solving. "I've managed this house for 30 years," I said slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I can manage it still." Before he could reply, I heard my daughter's voice in the background. She was on speaker. "Mom, listen, we're not trying to upset you. But the reality is, this house isn't practical anymore. It would be easier for everyone if we sold it. The money could help with your expenses, and it would give us peace of mind." The air in the room thickened. My grip on the phone tightened. "Peace of mind for you," I whispered, though I knew they could hear. Her tone sharpened. "That's not fair." "No," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "What's not fair is standing in my home, planning my future without asking me. What's not fair is treating me like I'm already gone." Silence. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Then my son's voice, colder than before. "You're being unreasonable. Do you even hear yourself? You're making this harder for everyone. We're trying to do what's best, and you're fighting us." I wanted to shout, to tell him that best wasn't the same for everyone, that what was best for them meant erasing me. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch. "Mom?" my daughter prompted. "I hear you," I said finally, "but I will not leave my house, and I will not be pushed aside." The call ended soon after, both of them frustrated, both convinced I was being selfish. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faded linoleum. My hands trembled. Not from weakness, but from the force of holding back everything I wanted to scream. That night, I dreamt I was standing outside my house, watching strangers carry my furniture out to the street. My children were there, directing the movers, smiling as though they were doing me a kindness. I screamed, but no sound came out. I woke, drenched in sweat. The fear was real, but so was the anger. The next morning, I pulled out the notebook again. Instead of writing memories, I wrote a list. I have the right to decide where I live. I have the right to control my belongings. I have the right to say no. Seeing the words in ink steadied me. For so long, I had been defined by what I gave: meals, care, time, attention. But now, my value was being measured by what could be taken. That realization cut deeper than any argument. Days passed in tense silence. Then, one afternoon, my daughter arrived unannounced. Her eyes were red, her shoulders stiff. She sat across from me, fidgeting with her ring. "Mom," she said, softer this time, "we just don't want to lose you. Don't you see that?" I searched her face. Was it guilt? Love? Fear? Maybe all of it tangled together. You won't lose me, I said. Unless you keep treating me like I don't matter. Her chin trembled. For a moment, I saw the child in her again, the one who once cried into my chest after a nightmare. Then she looked away. I don't understand why you can't make this easier, she whispered. Because my life is not supposed to be easy for you, I replied. It's supposed to be mine. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. She stood, kissed my cheek, and left. When the door closed, I realized something had shifted. The lines had been drawn clearly now. They might still push, still plot, but I had found my voice. For the first time, I felt the weight of my children's disapproval and realized I could survive it. And that was the breaking point. Not their insistence, not the pressure, but the quiet understanding that I didn't need their permission to live my life. The morning after my daughter's visit, I sat at the table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, catching dust in the air. I stared at the familiar kitchen walls, the chipped tile, the clock that ticked a little too loudly. Every detail of the house seemed to lean toward me, whispering, "You belong here." For weeks I had been reacting, responding to demands, defending my ground. But that morning, I realized defense wasn't enough. If I didn't take action, someone else would. So I opened a drawer, pulled out a folder of old bills, deeds, and insurance papers, and spread them across the table. The documents felt heavy, like proof that my life had substance, proof I still held authority. I dialed my lawyer's number, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. His secretary patched me through, and when his calm voice came on the line, I surprised even myself. I need to make some updates to my will, I said, and I want to set clear instructions about my house. There was a pause. Of course, he replied. Do you want me to come by, or would you prefer to meet at my office? Here, I said. This house is where I intend to stay. Hanging up, I felt something shift. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was power. The kind I hadn't felt in a long time. Later that week, when he arrived, I walked him through every detail. Who could have access to what? Which possessions carried meaning beyond money? And most importantly, that the house could not be sold without my consent while I lived. When I signed the documents, the pen felt like a weapon in my hand. That night, I called my children. My voice was calm, not defensive this time. I've updated my will, I said. The house is secured, I'm not leaving it. That is final. My son's breath caught on the line. Mom, why would you? Because I will not be erased, I interrupted. My voice surprised me. Steady, unshaken. You may not agree, but this is my decision. You can choose to accept it or keep fighting me. But either way, I'm not moving. The silence stretched. My daughter sighed audibly, but I didn't wait for their arguments. I ended the call myself. For once, I had the last word. That night, I slept better than I had in months. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. The fear that had hovered over me like a storm cloud began to lift. I cooked meals for myself without rushing. I walked through my garden and noticed buds forming on the rose bushes. I even joined a local reading group at the library, something I had always said I'd do someday. At the first meeting, a woman named Grace sat beside me. Her laugh was low, her voice gravelly, her hair silver and wild. She leaned close during introductions and whispered, "First time?" "Yes," I said, smiling nervously. "Don't worry, none of us bite. We just argue about books and complain about our kids." Her bluntness startled a laugh out of me. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. After the meeting, she walked me to my car. "You seemed tense," she observed. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, then found myself telling her the truth. About the phone calls, the arguments, the pressure to leave my home. She listened quietly, nodding now and then. When I finished, she put a hand on my arm. "Let me tell you something. The day you stop fighting for your own life is the day you stop living. Don't hand them that victory." Her words burned into me like a brand. I carried them home. Over the next few weeks, I began making small but deliberate changes. I arranged for a gardener to help once a month. Not because I couldn't manage, but because I wanted to keep the house strong and thriving. I fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door. I even repainted the living room myself, brushstroke after brushstroke, transforming the dull beige into a warmer, brighter shade. Each task was a declaration. This house is alive because I am alive. Of course, my children noticed. My daughter called one evening, her tone wary. "I hear you've been busy," she said. "Yes," I answered simply. She sighed. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I replied, setting the paintbrush down as I spoke. "I'm making it mine." The conversation ended shortly after, but I didn't feel shaken. Their disapproval no longer frightened me. Instead, I began to realize something. I wasn't just protecting my home. I was protecting my identity. For so long, I had been cast in the role of caretaker, peacemaker, provider. But those roles had limits. Now, in this stage of life, I was discovering a role I had neglected: self-preserver. One morning, as I sat in the newly painted living room, notebook in hand, I wrote these words across a fresh page. "I will not apologize for existing." And as simple as they were, they felt like a shield. The next chapter of my life wasn't about clinging desperately to what was being taken. It was about building something new from what remained. The calls stopped for a while after I laid down my boundary. At first, I thought maybe they had accepted it. Maybe they were finally giving me the space to breathe. But silence has its own kind of weight. It can be heavy with peace or heavy with threat. This silence felt like the second kind. One Saturday afternoon, as I was pruning the rose bushes in the yard, a car pulled up. Not one, but two. My son and daughter had arrived together, something they rarely did unless it was an emergency. My stomach clenched, but I stood straighter, clippers still in hand. They got out, their expressions tight, eyes avoiding mine as they approached. "Mom," my daughter said, her tone clipped. "We need to talk." "Of course you do," I answered, brushing soil from my gloves. I didn't invite them inside. Instead, we stood in the yard, under the pale afternoon light, the roses between us. My son crossed his arms. "This is getting out of hand. We've tried to be patient, but you're making unreasonable choices." Unreasonable. The word stung, but I kept my face calm. "What's unreasonable," I said slowly, "is thinking you can erase me from my own home." My daughter stepped forward. "Mom, we're not trying to erase you. We're trying to help you. Don't you see? You're clinging to things that don't make sense anymore. The house is too big. The garden, the upkeep, it's too much. You're acting like you're 25. Her words might have crushed me months ago. But now I only felt a flicker of anger, quickly cooled into clarity. "Maybe I can't do everything I once did," I admitted. "But I decide what I hold on to. Not you." They exchanged glances, a silent exchange of strategy. Then my son pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket. "What's this?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. "It's an agreement," he said, stepping closer. "If you sign this, we'll handle everything. The sale of the house, the distribution of your things. You'll be secure, comfortable. You won't have to worry about a thing." I didn't even reach for it. "Put that away," I said. "Mom," my daughter pressed, her voice rising now. "Do you want to end up alone? Do you want to be found one day, collapsed in a house you couldn't manage, surrounded by things that mean nothing to anyone but you?" Her words were sharp, like knives thrown carelessly in my direction. For a moment, I almost felt them pierce. But then I looked past her, at the roses I had tended, their petals bright against the green. They meant nothing to her, maybe, but they meant everything to me. "I am not alone," I said, voice steady. "I have myself. I have my life. And I will not trade them for your convenience." My son's jaw tightened. "You're being stubborn." I took a step forward, meeting his eyes. "No, I'm being alive." The silence that followed was thick, charged. A bird called from a nearby tree, breaking the stillness. Neither of them spoke. Finally, my daughter folded her arms. "Fine," she said coldly, "if that's how you want it. But don't expect us to clean up the mess when it all falls apart." Without another word, they turned back toward their cars. I didn't stop them. I didn't plead. I didn't even wave. I simply stood in my garden, surrounded by the roses, and watched them leave. When the sound of the engines faded down the street, I sank onto the garden bench. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. From release. They had tried their last weapon: pressure, guilt, paperwork, and it had failed. They might try again, but something fundamental had shifted. I had stood in the storm without bending. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table, a pen in hand. I began writing in my notebook again, not just thoughts, but plans for the future. Plans that didn't revolve around my children's demands, but around my own choices. For years, I had lived as though I were a guest in my own home, waiting for their approval, fearing their judgment. But not anymore. If they thought they could divide my possessions while I still lived, they were wrong. Because I had decided something they didn't yet know. I would not let them inherit control. I would decide where everything went, how it was used, and what it meant. And I would do it while I was still here, still able to act. As I wrote, I could almost hear Grace's voice from the library group. The day you stop fighting for your own life is the day you stop living. I wasn't done living. Not by a long shot. After my children left that afternoon, silence filled the house again. But this silence wasn't threatening the way it had been before. It was lighter, almost companionable, as if the walls and furniture had sighed with relief right alongside me. I sat at the table, notebook open, pen balanced between my fingers. For years, I had written lists: groceries, chores, reminders of appointments. But that evening, my writing took on a different shape. I began sketching out possibilities. Not for them, for me. I listed the objects in my home, not as possessions to be handed down, but as memories. The brooch, the tray, the old photographs, the clock on the mantel that chimed a beat too slow. Each item had a story. Each carried weight. And suddenly, the thought of my children fighting over them like vultures felt unbearable. That was when the idea came. Not as a full plan, but as a whisper. What if I decided the fate of these things myself? What if I gave them away, not to those who demanded them, but to those who would see their worth? The more I thought about it, the more the idea grew. I didn't want my possessions to become bargaining chips in someone else's game. I wanted them to breathe, to find homes where they'd be valued. Perhaps with collectors, perhaps with strangers. People who saw beauty instead of burden. The next morning, I brought the idea to Grace. We met at the little cafe across from the library. She raised her eyebrows as I explained, her spoon frozen above her teacup. "You're serious?" she asked finally. "Completely," I said. "If they want to treat me like I'm invisible, I'll make myself visible in a way they can't control. I'll decide what happens to everything, on my terms." Grace, he smiled slowly, a spark in her eyes. "That's bold." "It's necessary," I replied. We talked for an hour, maybe more. She told me about a friend of hers who once downsized by holding a small private auction. Not the kind with fast-talking auctioneers, but an intimate gathering. People who appreciated antiques, art, or even just curiosities. The thought thrilled me. I could almost picture it. My living room transformed, chairs lined neatly, the clock ticking in the corner as people raised their hands to bid on the stories I had lived. But more than the image, it was the principle. It would be my stage, my rules, my decision. That night, back home, I opened my closet and began pulling out boxes. One by one, I laid items across the bed. The quilt my grandmother stitched, the ring my husband bought me on our 15th anniversary, the painting I had picked up at a flea market for $5 but loved for 50 years. For each, I wrote a card, a description, a memory, sometimes even a note about what it had meant to me. I wasn't just cataloging things, I was reclaiming them. As I worked, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't about money, it was about choice. It was about refusing to let my story be written by anyone but me. Of course, doubt crept in. I imagined my children's faces if they discovered what I was doing. The anger, the accusations. How could you give away what's meant for us? But I reminded myself, what's meant for them is not mine to decide, is mine. until the day I choose otherwise. 2 weeks later, I quietly arranged the first steps. Grace connected me with her friend, who in turn introduced me to someone who hosted small estate sales and auctions. We met in a coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of the neighborhood. She was a brisk, practical woman with sharp glasses and a sharper mind. "You don't want the usual family involvement?" she asked, flipping open her planner. "No," I said firmly. "This stays between us." She gave a knowing nod. Families often complicate things. From that moment, the plan became real. We set a date. I began preparing the house, not to give up everything, but to offer a selection. The pieces I wanted to see in new hands while I was still alive to watch it happen. And yet, beneath the excitement, there was fear. What if the children found out? What if they stormed in and tried to stop me? One evening, as I dusted the clock, I looked at my reflection in its glass. My face lined with years, my eyes weary but sharp. Fear, I realized, was what had kept me silent for too long. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. But I was already alone, in the ways that mattered most. And somehow, in that solitude, I had found my strength. So I pressed forward. The day of the auction approached, and the house began to shift. Tables were rearranged, items tagged and cataloged. Grace helped, her laughter filling the rooms as we worked. For the first time in years, my house didn't feel like a waiting room for death. It felt like a theater, buzzing with preparation, alive with purpose. I caught myself smiling as I wrote another card, this one for the silver tray my mother had given me. On it, I wrote, "Scratched from years of service, but still shining," much like its owner. The morning of the auction arrived with a strange calm. I had expected to wake with my stomach in knots, but instead I felt steady, as though some part of me had already crossed a threshold I could never retreat from. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, catching dust motes that danced in the air like small blessings. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, listening to the familiar ticking of the mantel clock. Today, that clock wasn't just a timekeeper. It was a witness. By mid-morning, Grace arrived carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. "Every event needs a centerpiece," she said with a wink, arranging them in the crystal vase that had once belonged to my grandmother. I almost laughed at the thought of someone bidding on that vase later, unaware that only hours ago it had been filled with something as ordinary as supermarket tulips. The auction organizer, the sharp-eyed woman with glasses, arrived shortly after. She moved with brisk efficiency, arranging chairs, setting out programs, checking that each item had its number. My house no longer looked like my home. It looked like a stage. As people began to trickle in, curiosity gleamed in their eyes. Neighbors, collectors, acquaintances of acquaintances. Some wore eager expressions, others cautious ones. To them, this was just another estate event. They didn't know the true story, the betrayal, the choice, the defiance hidden in every object. I stood near the back of the room, watching, my palms damp. Grace squeezed my hand. "Remember," she whispered, "this is your story, not theirs." The auctioneer cleared her throat and began. Her voice was firm, rhythmic, pulling the room's attention into order. "The first item," she announced, lifting the quilt. "Hand-stitched, mid-century, excellent condition. We'll start at 50. Hands went up. Numbers called. Voices eager. The quilt was gone in minutes, claimed by a woman in a green scarf who smiled as though she'd won a treasure. I watched with a mixture of grief and relief. That quilt had once warmed my children's beds. It had been wrapped around them during storms. And yet, in this moment, it felt right that it was leaving. Not stolen, not argued over. Chosen. Valued. One by one, the items passed from my life into others' hands. The brooch gleamed under the lights, snapped up by a collector with sharp cheekbones. The silver tea, Ray, with my little note tucked discreetly beneath it, went to a young man who seemed charmed by its history. As each item disappeared, I felt lighter. Not empty, but unburdened. Then came the clock. The auctioneer lifted it carefully, announcing its slight imperfection but praising its craftsmanship. Bidding began, hesitant at first, then spirited. I stood rooted to the floor, hearing the familiar chime echo in my memory. That clock had marked birthdays, anniversaries, long nights of waiting for children who came home late. Finally, it was claimed by an older gentleman in the front row. He smiled warmly as the hammer fell, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. He gave a small nod as if he understood that he wasn't just buying a clock. He was inheriting time itself. By the end of the afternoon, the tables were bare. The rooms echoed differently, less cluttered, more open. I expected sadness to sweep over me, but instead I felt exhilarated, as though I had pulled off a daring escape. The organizer tallied the proceeds in a small ledger and handed me the total. The number startled me. It was far more than I had imagined. Grace leaned over my shoulder, whistling softly. "Well," she said, "that'll ruffle a few feathers." We both knew what she meant. Because I hadn't done this merely to rid myself of things. I had done it with a purpose my children would hate. That evening, I sat again at my kitchen table, staring at the ledger. The decision had already been made in my heart. The proceeds would go to a cause I believed in, one my children openly mocked, an organization that supported women starting over later in life, those rebuilding from divorce, abuse, abandonment. Women like me, though I had found my own footing in a different way. The thought of their faces when they discovered it made me smile. Not out of malice, but out of justice. For once, I was no longer the passive mother waiting for approval. I was the architect of my own ending, and perhaps my own beginning. When Grace left that night, hugging me tightly at the door, I stood alone in the quiet house. My possessions were gone. My children would be furious. But I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I had in decades. The clock was no longer ticking in my house, but I felt time moving differently now, forward, not backward. And I realized I hadn't lost anything today. I had gained everything. I didn't have to call them. They came on their own. 2 days after the auction, I heard tires crunching in the driveway, the sharp slam of a car door. My son was the first through the kitchen door, red-faced, chest heaving like he'd run a mile. My daughters trailed behind, whispering angrily to one another, their eyes darting around the stripped-down rooms. "What did you do?" my son demanded, his voice breaking the quiet like a hammer. I stayed seated at the table, my teacup in front of me. I didn't stand to greet them, not this time. "You can see for yourself, the furniture, the china, the clock. Everything's gone," one of my daughters shouted, her voice shrill with disbelief. She strode through the living room as though she might find the things hidden behind a curtain. "You sold it? You actually sold it all?" I nodded once. "Yes, I did." For a moment, the silence was thicker than any argument. Then the anger came. "How could you do this without telling us?" my son snapped. "Those things were supposed to stay in the family. They were supposed to come to us." "Come to you?" I asked, steady but firm. "You mean like the way you already divided them up while I was still alive? I remember hearing you, speaking as if I were already gone." Their faces froze. None of them expected me to say it out loud. "That was just talk," one daughter muttered, but her voice carried no conviction. "No," I said softly, "it wasn't. It was a decision you made without me. I simply made my own decision in turn." Their expressions shifted. Anger, shock, a hint of guilt that quickly hardened into resentment. My son threw his hands up. "This isn't fair. Dad wanted us to have those things." I met his eyes, and for once he looked away. "Your father is gone. I am not. And those things were never promises. They were mine to do with as I chose." One daughter's eyes filled with tears. "But Mom, you could have at least asked us. We would have helped you. We would have found a better way." I held her gaze. "No. You would have fought me. You would have insisted, pressured, worn me down until I gave in. And I was tired of being worn down." The words settled over us. Heavy, undeniable. They didn't know what to say. So I said it for them. "I'm not a ghost in this house anymore. I made a choice for myself, not for you. And I don't regret it." Their frustration boiled over into accusation. "So where's the money then? What did you do with it?" I took a long breath, feeling the moment sharpen. This was the part they feared the most. Not the loss of the objects, but the loss of control. "I've donated it," I said plainly. To an organization that helps women start over when they've been left with nothing. Women who've been silenced, dismissed, made to feel small. Women like me. Their shock was almost comical. Mouths open, eyes wide, as though I had confessed to burning the house down. "You gave it away?" my son shouted. "To strangers?" "Yes," I said, my voice unwavering, because I would rather those strangers have a chance at building their lives than watch my own children treat me as if I were already gone. The words cut. I could see it in the way their shoulders stiffened, the way they refused to look directly at me. But I didn't say them to wound. I said them because they were true. One daughter whispered, "We just wanted to hold on to memories." "Memories don't live in furniture," I replied gently. "They live in people. And I hope one day you'll see that." We sat in silence then, the air thick with everything unsaid. They were angry, yes. But beneath it I caught something else. Fear. Fear that I was no longer theirs to command. Fear that I had slipped out of the roles they had written for me. Finally, my son stood, shaking his head. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Perhaps," I said, "but it will be my regret, not yours." They left soon after, the slam of the door echoing through the house. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the sound. When the driveway emptied and the house grew quiet again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands trembled, but not with fear, with release. I walked through the bare rooms slowly, letting the silence wrap around me. No clutter, no reminders, no unspoken obligations weighing me down. Just space and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. That night, lying in bed, I thought of the women who would benefit from the donation. I imagined them unpacking boxes, starting jobs, reclaiming pieces of themselves. That was the true inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Not objects, not grudges, but proof that change was possible at any age. The house was quieter than it had ever been. But for the first time, I did not feel alone. The days after their visit were strangely calm. No more phone calls. No more footsteps echoing angrily through the hallways. Just silence. And my own company. For years, I had feared that kind of silence, filling it with other people's needs, their arguments, their demands. Now it was something else entirely, freedom. I began small. I rearranged the kitchen, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. I moved the table closer to the window where the morning sun poured in, its light warming the wood. Every breakfast after that felt brighter, as if the house itself was breathing again. One afternoon, I went into the garden. The flower beds had been neglected for too long, overrun with weeds. I knelt down and began pulling them up, one by one, my fingers digging into the soil. The earth was cool, alive, forgiving. It didn't care how old I was. It didn't hold grudges. It simply waited, ready for new things to grow. And as I worked, I realized that was me now. For so long, I had let myself believe that my worth was measured in what I gave away, what I sacrificed, what I endured quietly. I thought being a mother meant shrinking until everyone else had room to expand. But that wasn't living. It was disappearing. By giving up the possessions, I had thought I was losing pieces of my life. But really, I was clearing space for something else. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the open window. The air smelled faintly of lilacs. My house was quieter, emptier, but it felt honest. It was no longer a museum to someone else's expectations. It was mine. That night, I took out a notebook. I had bought it years ago, intending to fill it with recipes for my children. Instead, I began writing letters to myself, not instructions or reminders, but truths. You are not invisible. You are not too old to begin again. You deserve joy without permission. The words looked strange at first, almost defiant, but they were mine. And for the first time in a long while, I believed them. A week later, I received a letter from the charity I had donated to. They wrote about how the funds had already been used to help 3 women secure housing. They included a short story about one woman who had escaped a situation where she had nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she had a small apartment and a chance at a job. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. That was it. That was the legacy I wanted. Not arguments over who owned and what? Not bitterness passed down like an heirloom. Real change. Real hope. I knew my children were still angry. Perhaps they always would be. Perhaps years from now they might understand. Or perhaps they wouldn't. Either way, I had given them something they didn't realize they needed. The truth. One Sunday morning, I walked to the park near my house. Families were gathered there, children running, couples strolling, older women like me sitting on benches watching the world move around them. I sat beneath a large oak tree, its branches stretching wide, strong, unshaken by time. As I looked up at its canopy, I thought of all the storms it must have endured. Winds strong enough to break lesser trees, yet here it stood, not in spite of its scars, but because of them. That was me too. I closed my eyes, letting the sunlight filter through the leaves onto my face. For the first time in years, I felt entirely present. Not defined by what had been taken or by what I had given, but by the simple fact that I was still here, still growing, still choosing, still mine. And just maybe, that was the lesson I had needed all along. It is never too late to claim your own life. And if this story struck a chord with you, don't stop here. I've got another story waiting. One that shows how strength can rise from the most unexpected places. Just click on the relink, and let's keep walking this journey together.